All right, I propose we get started. We have over 60 participants, so that's a great turnout. Thank you all very much for joining. Very welcome to this webinar where we will be presenting some recent work on a FAIR assessment framework for data services. My name is Hielke Koers. I'm with SURF. I'm the task leader of this task under the FAIRsFAIR project. And I'm here joined today by my colleague Patricia Herterich from the DCC. And we'll be co-presenting this. I will start with the welcome and the introduction and then hand over to Patricia for methodology and findings. I'll talk about the framework and we'll do the interactive session, the Q&A, and talking about your feedback and an interactive session together. And then we plan to be ready sharp at the hour. Two things to be aware of: the session will be recorded and made available. And also, if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat. We'll try to keep an eye on that. There is a bit of time for Q&A slotted in. But we'll try to keep an eye on the chat as we go through and see if we can address any questions or any feedback that you have as we go. So without further ado, let me start with a brief introduction. And I'd like to start with the FAIRsFAIR project, because not everybody in the audience might be familiar with that. So just in a nutshell, it's one of the projects that came out of the Infra EOSC-5 call. It has been awarded a budget of around 10 million. And the lifetime is 3 years, 36 months starting in March. These are the 6 core partners. Project management and overall leadership is with DANS in the Netherlands. But all in all, it's a much broader coalition, 23 partners from 8 different member states. And we're very pleased that also our UK-based partners are all able to continue their work in the project despite the Brexit. That's of course great, but that continues to go. The objective of the FAIRsFAIR project overall is to supply practical solutions for the use of FAIR data principles throughout the research data lifecycle. And here the emphasis is really on fostering the FAIR data culture and the uptake of good practices. So really translating FAIR principles and the FAIR paradigm into action, making it work and making it practical. Another way to look at that objective is perhaps to say that it's meant to follow up and implement some of the recommendations from the EOSC high-level expert group and the expert group on FAIR data. And yet another way of looking at it, or a metaphor that we started to use recently, is that perhaps it's about composing and playing a FAIR symphony, where here the symphony is a metaphor for the FAIR data ecosystem, with different sections, each playing their own part in harmony. And then stretching the analogy even a little bit further, you could think about the nodes in a symphony as the data objects, and then the services and the infrastructure that act upon those nodes as the rhythm or the cadence that are also part to have a nice, well-sounding symphony. This emphasis on applying the FAIR principles and the FAIR framework not only to data objects, but also to the services and the infrastructure that act on those objects was also very clear in the Turning FAIR into Reality report. It's called out specifically in recommendation 13, which calls for the development of metrics to certify FAIR services. And this is one of the main inputs, if you like, one of the directions going into the work that we'd like to present here today. Because if you take a little bit of a step back, if you want to turn FAIR into a reality, it's important to give people handles to do that and guidance. As we all know, FAIR is a journey. It's not an absolute. It's a set of guiding principles that still need and require further interpretation and definition. And that's not a flaw, that's by design, because it takes time to do this together with the community in such a way that it really adds value also in your specific disciplines. A lot of work has gone into this, and a lot of results have come out for data sets and other digital objects in the last couple of years. Also quite a lot of work on data repositories specifically, and how some of the values of data repositories, for example, as codified in Core Trust Seal, how they can play along with the FAIR principles. That's also been the subject of quite a lot of work. But for service owners, for owners of data services other than data repositories, I think it's fair to say that there is relatively little guidance on how to make their service fit in the FAIR deep data ecosystem. So not a lot of concrete recommendations, concrete suggestions on what you can do to evolve your service to really become part of that FAIR symphony. So that's the objective that we have formulated as task 2.4 in the FAIRsFAIR project, to deliver an assessment framework that can help data service owners to incrementally improve their service and really drive towards that optimal interplay between fair digital objects and services. And in doing that, help to realize the full potential of this FAIR ecosystem, or maybe, again, in other words, have a really nice sounding FAIR symphony. We started this work already quite some time ago. We have also delivered some outputs, published some publications or some milestone reports on Zenodo. Just to call out, well, one here in this case. This was an output that was included in the assessment report, and the link is at the bottom. We will, of course, make this available as well. This is a series of case studies and a methodology to assess the FAIR enablement qualities of a service. And here the methodology that we have proposed here really recognize sort of 3 different modes that services can enable certain aspects of FAIR, they can respect certain aspects of FAIR, but also in some cases reduce it, for example, if metadata or PIDs are stripped off or in other ways. So this puts forward a methodology to look at a given data service and then see in what sense it is enabling some of the FAIR principles and in what sense it might be respecting them or even reducing them. The other output, and that is really the core of the webinar today, is a basic framework to do the assessment of FAIR service, of FAIR enabling services. This page for now is intentionally left blank. We will be presenting this framework, but I wanted to do that after I give the floor to Patricia to talk a little bit more about the methodology and the findings that went into the formulation of this framework. So Patricia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hilke, and hello from me to everyone. Can you move to the next slide, please? And actually, yeah, that one already. I'll introduce the methodology that we've used and the findings we've gathered that went into the draft assessment framework that Hilke will pick up in a bit. Our methodology really builds on 3 major blocks. We've done a structured literature review covering earlier work on service assessment, such as Core Trust Seal, and recent work that has happened in various EOSC-related funded projects. We've also carried out interviews with some service owners to get their views on what a FAIR assessment framework could look like. And back in May last year, we hosted a session from a FAIRsFAIR project at the EOSC-hub week, an interactive workshop on FAIRification of repositories and other data services that had an interactive part like this webinar today will have, and those results also fed into the assessment framework. Next slide, please. So the first bit that we looked at was like really an extensive literature review, and we covered 18 papers and reports. We read more, but those went into the final analysis. And the way we analyzed them is that we extracted statements, almost 250 in total, and coded them by the type of statement. Is it a recommendation for a service, a principle, an action for service owners? And we also wanted to know if they are applicable to a wider range of data services, or if they are very specific to a specific service group. Although we have to say that we didn't use a taxonomy of data services because we're not aware of one existing yet, although the literature, and we agree to some extent that says that that would be a useful thing to develop, but it's out of scope for this work. So we haven't covered that. Next slide, please. So what we found in our literature review is that there are various projects working on FAIR data object assessment. So there's a lot of activity in that area, but there's less focus on FAIR enabling services. And the work that we've looked at in detail is characterized by really a wide diversity in the type of statements, which makes it quite difficult to compare and harmonize everything that's out there. Also, there's understandably focus on certain aspects when like authors have you know, a certain interest in areas, but that could result in an unbalanced view. The recommendations and requirements that we found in the literature, it's sometimes unclear how they should be implemented or to what extent they might be implemented in some services already. And that is like also stressed by the lack of case studies reporting on implementations and reporting benefits and challenges. And for us, it also was rather unclear or abstract what the relation to the wider EOSC work, for example, the EOSC rules of participation or other documents from EOSC are. Next slide, please. The second major methodology block was interviews. We've carried out 5 interviews with service owners, and they were about an hour each. They were semi-structured, and we tried to cover 4 major parts. We tried to get an understanding of the service, the users, and the context the service operates in, how mature and sustainable the service is, and we also try to understand what the affinity and familiarity with FAIR is already, and then had an open discussion about what that FAIR assessment framework that we're trying to come up with could be. Next slide, please. Again, we analyzed that similar to the literature review. We extracted statements from our interview transcript and then coded them by type. In that case, it was like what does the service offer already and what would be a useful addition, what is on the service owner's wish list. And that is both on a technical and a social level. Where it was applicable, we mapped it to actually a FAIR principle that a statement explicitly supported. Also tried to understand how far implemented that is already, and if that applies to that specific service, or if that is a recommendation or feature that can apply wider. And you can look at the full analysis on Zenodo if you want to. Next slide, please. From our interviews, the main findings were that the services that we talked to basically supported aspects of FAIR, and they did so before the term was coined and the principles were established. They have had a good understanding of the communities they served and what they wanted from them, but also were quite aware of the wider policy context they were working in. And quite interestingly, they quite a few of them found that automated fairness assessment tools for the objects and the data sets that their services interact on could be quite helpful, but they didn't want to be developing them themselves. They agreed that that would be like something that the wider community would need to agree on how exactly fairness would be assessed. All of them also highlighted the human aspect in this, and that the training for users will be needed, but also training for the people that run the service to keep up to date. And that sustainable funding will be crucial because many features and things are developed on project funding, but are not necessarily supported or that well supported in the long term. And in terms of the FAIR assessment framework, they preferred an external and community endorsed framework that basically assesses them provided by some entity, and were not too keen on self-assessment. And this next slide will illustrate some of these points again with quotes from our interviews. One of our interviewee basically compared the whole setup to driving and learning to drive. So basically the cars is the infrastructure, and then you have here in the UK it's an MOT, but in other countries it's quite similar, that you actually have like an external entity that certifies that the car is safe to drive. And even if you have a car, you need a driving instructor. So you need that human being that trains up the users in how to use their car safely. And all these components are also needed in a fair enabling service economy. And the other quote again, like highlights that it should be an external self-assessment, an external assessment and not a self-assessment, apologies, because self-assessments basically tend to select for people who advertise themselves well, whereas like an external one might be more objective and doesn't necessarily depend that much on the advertising qualities of the service owners. Next slide, please. And the last bit that we looked at was that EOSC-hub session that we ran, where we presented some of the early work that Hilke has given you a quick look at in the introduction. And then in the interactive part, gathered feedback on the scope, that is the type of services that are is essential to enable fair data, and that should be in scope for being assessed by this framework. The desired qualities for a service that help enabling fair data. And again, similar to the interviews, the form that the assessment framework should take, if it should be just sharing recommendations and good practice, or if it should actually be formal certification. And back in that session, we had 90 active contributors to the Mentimeter, where we gathered that information, and almost half of them identified as service providers. So the main group of people that we actually want to get feedback from, although everyone else is welcome to comment as well. Next slide. And here are some findings from the sessions. In terms of scope, you can see the word cloud. So we had this as like free text questions, and then did some analysis, standardization, and harmonization on top. And the main services that stood out are persistent identifier services, repositories, because they are quite established, but also metadata services, which is understandably seen as metadata plays quite a crucial role in making data sets fair. Next one. For desired qualities for a service, interoperability scored high. Again, so did metadata and standards compliance. But you can also see that like the fifth place already is user friendliness. So that chimes with the results from the interviews, that you need to address the humans as well. And that is a crucial part of a successful service. And the last one on the form, where we basically had like people set their preferences on a scale from 0 to 10. And in that session, actually sharing good practices and recommendations was the most preferred version. So unlike the interviews that we carried out, formal certification didn't score that high. Quite a few people thought that was like still quite difficult to achieve and might be more to further down the line an option, to start with sharing good practices just to get everyone on the same page and started on this journey would be the way to go. And that's all the findings we gathered, and I'll hand back to Hilke, and he can now let you know how that all feeds into our draft assessment framework.
Great, thank you very much, Patricia. And we have a bit of time reserved for questions after this bit, but we thought it would make sense to first now show you how we have pieced all of these streams of inputs together to come to a basic assessment framework, which I wanted to take you through now in the next couple of minutes. And a few things I wanted to say that we haven't put on the slides, but we have spoken about them, I think, and I just want to reiterate them again. I think the first point to note is this basic framework is really meant to guide the further evolution and give guidance and recommendations. It's not meant to be a pass-fail type of test. Its purpose is to help data service providers, data service owners, to get a sense of what they can do to make their service more fair enabling. I also wanted to stress that again, it's really about making the service better enable fair and support the FAIRification process. It's not just about making the service itself findable and accessible, etc., but really playing that part in the FAIR symphony. And also we have deliberately at this point in time taking a fairly generic view. So we're not looking into specific recommendations for individual domains. We would expect and we would like to see that being picked up at some point in time, probably within those domains themselves. But this is really more the foundational, the horizontal framework to underpin those kind of endeavors. And the last thing I wanted to say is that what we are presenting now, which is also part of this report, that was published on Zenodo at the end of November. This is our basic framework. It's a version 1.0, if you like, and we very much welcome feedback. And we actually have planned over the next couple of months a very active approach of community consultation, including workshops, etc. So this is really our first version, and we will iterate on that leading up to an eventual framework that we will publish around summer. With that all being said, let me take you through some of the structure of the framework and how it consists. And also in this session afterwards, after the Q&A, we also want to get your view. So we have prepared some discussions on Mentimeter so that you can also give your feedback to see if what we have so far makes sense and how we can improve it. So a couple of things to mention. First of all, so we have, grouped all our recommendations and all our concept into 6 different aspects. 3 are a bit more technically oriented. They are about fair enablement, quality of service, and being open and connected. And 3 are more socially oriented around user centricity, trustworthiness, and ethical and legal matters. For each of those aspects, we have formulated a high-level objective, which really states, what should be the qualities that this service brings in this particular aspect. And then for under all those objectives, we have formulated a number of actionable, more detailed recommendations that are really supposed to be actionable in the sense that as a service owner, you read this and ideally you would immediately know how to apply it if you would indeed want to do that. And again, it's all recommendations. This is not meant to be normative or pass-fail in any way. Given the time today, because we have an hour for the full webinar, we've decided to not go into the individual recommendations because that would be adding too great a level of detail at this point in time. We're also planning a workshop around mid-February. I have a little bit more detail about that later on, where we do want to go into the individual recommendations. So if you have specific thoughts about that or feedback or ideas that you would want to bring to the table, please share them with us. They are very welcome, either as part of this webinar or offline, but also in this workshop would be a great place to discuss those. So let me go through, and I realize there's quite a bit of text on these slides, but we did think it's important to go through all of these aspects. So I wanted to present all of these 6 objectives. And in a bit, we'll ask your feedback, well, both in the Q&A, but also in a guided discussion through Mentimeter. So as I go through, I'd like to ask you to already, maybe with a piece of paper and a pen or in your head, to already sort of note which of these aspects you would find the most important and the most relevant, in the sense of where you feel this is where the greatest gain is to be had in terms of ultimately enabling this FAIR data ecosystem and helping data services to support that. So the first of our aspects is around FAIR enablement. And here the formulated objective is that the service enables FAIR data by elevating the fairness of digital objects and/or support the FAIRification process. FAIR enablement is actively driven through the implementation of community-supported standards and interoperability frameworks. And again, in the report that we've published, there are detailed recommendations on how to implement this or how to get to this objective. But this is the high-level objective that we formulated. So really around FAIRification, etc. The second aspect is orthogonal to that, I would say. It's around quality of service, and it states that the service is delivered in a reliable, secure, high-quality way, consistent with its specifications. And I think some of you will recognize that the language here is also borrowed from FIT-SM and other IT management specifications. So really around delivering the service in a way that is as expected and meets the requirements. Open and connected states, the objective here states that the service is operated in a transparent, low barrier and inclusive way, actively seeking integrations and connections with other services and championing principles of openness consistent with open science and open research. So really saying the service, an ideal FAIR enabling service does not sit in isolation. It is inclusive, it is open, and it is connected. Moving towards the more socially oriented aspect. Here we also formulated 3 objectives, and the first one is around user centricity. It states that the service is managed such that it serves the possibly evolving goals of the user community, maximizing usability while minimizing burden. So really placing the user, typically the researcher, on the pedestal, if you like, taking a very user-centric point of view as you go through the development of the service. Trustworthiness states that the service is perceived by the user community as reliable and trustworthy, both in terms of its utility and its warranties, now and in the future. And this is a statement not only about the service in and of itself, but also the organization surrounded it. And will the organization, is that trustworthy in the sense that you can expect that the service will also be functioning as expected and as required in the future. This is the statement about now and in the future. Finally, the 6th aspect that we identified is around ethical and legal manners. And there we have sort of aggregated all of our recommendations in the stated objective that the service complies with all applicable legal and ethical guidelines, doing that in a transparent and auditable way. So that concludes the 6 aspects. I realize it's fairly high level at this point. Again, the recommendations add a lot of detail, but just given the time that also a lot more of them, we figured it's probably too much to also go into that level of detail today. But I do hope this gives a bit of flavor and some direction of the scope of the framework and how we think about the different aspects. And we'd love to hear from you also in a bit, which of these aspects you would think are of most importance and of most relevance to you, perhaps individually. And also if you feel that are aspects missing or things should be recombined or organized differently. So just to summarize, this basic framework, it is composed of 6 different aspects: FAIR enablement, quality, open and connected, user centricity, trustworthiness, ethical and legal aspects, clustered into more technically oriented matters and more socially oriented matters. And if you'd like to know more about this, we of course would love you to read the report. It's still also open for community consultation, so there's ample opportunity to give your feedback, which will allow us to improve and iterate. We do have a plan as well to further evolve this framework. So again, what we are presenting here is what we consider as version 1.0. So we are now at the top of this scheme. December is still just the end of January 2020. Still open into public consultation, and this webinar is part of that process. We are planning a workshop in February, it's open to everybody, but inviting different stakeholder groups to really validate mostly the completeness of the framework. Are there no important things that we have missed? And here we also really want to go beyond the level of the objectives and start to look at the individual recommendations that were sourced from the literature and the interviews and the EOSC-hub session, all of the streams that Patricia talked about. Then in March, we are planning to disseminate the findings and work on the next iteration of the framework. Have a second workshop in April, focusing a bit more tightly on service owners, because ultimately that is the target audience for the assessment framework. So they can validate not only the completeness, but also the utility and the actionability. Does it have enough detail to be really taken as an action and use it to evolve your service? And then over May, June, iterating a bit more and then aiming to complete and publish this as a final deliverable by August 2021. So that's our timeline. And we are really hoping and counting on some active community engagement there. Just to call out the workshop, the tentative date for that is February 19. We'll get this published as soon as possible. But if you are interested in this, please save the date. And also let us know if you would like to join, maybe leave your email address in the chat or send us an email afterwards. And then we will make sure that you receive an invitation. All right, then now we'd like to take a bit of time for Q&A following the presentation so far. So both the bits that Patricia presented and the bits that I presented. And then in the second half of the webinar, we'd like to switch gears a little bit to make it more interactive and get your feedback using a Mentimeter. I'll stop sharing now for a bit so we can also look at I saw some questions coming in through the Q&A and the text. While I stop sharing, maybe Patricia, would you be able to take the first question?
Yeah, especially as there are quite a few questions around the interviews, so I'll take those. One is around the service owners. What kind of service owners did we interview? As I said, there's not really like a taxonomy where you can pick one per category, but we try to spread it out to get various viewpoints. So we talked to a repository, we talked to an identifier service, we talked to an ontology service, and I think the last two ones were basically infrastructure providers, in the widest terms, like people that basically provide large data storage infrastructure to to their community. So we try to really have diversity there, but like with five interviews, you never cover everyone. That's impossible. We contacted a few more people, but just had time to do 5 interviews, and that's actually one of the reasons why we invite people to the workshops, to get more viewpoints, because there's that would be the opportunity to get a wider range of people on board. The next question again was around service providers weren't keen on carrying out self-assessments. Were they interested in participating in the process of developing the assessment criteria? I'm not sure if that came up. There was in most of the ones that I can recall right now, there was an agreement that the assessment criteria need to be developed by the community and be agreed by the wider community. And they are involved with the community, so they are on various working groups and in various fora that discuss those aspects. So they would be part of the conversation, but they didn't make that explicit that they feel they should be working on the assessment criteria. I guess when it comes to a version, they would feedback that some points are really more or less impossible to address to get formal certification, if that's what you're thinking of. But it didn't come up as such. Then there's a question on the risk that policymakers and funders will start demanding certain fairness scores in order to support fair services. I don't know, Hilke, is this something that you want to take?
Yeah, sure. I think whenever you start to measure things, there is always a risk, right? That the metric becomes a target in and of itself. We've had many discussions about this within the group. I can visualize some people giggling a little bit right now. So I think that is always a risk to be mindful of. I would say the best way to counteract such a risk is to make sure that you never focus on a single indicator. It should always be a basket, and make sure that you contextualize it well, that people understand that it's not a pass-fail, it's not green or red. It's really meant to give some guidance on how you can best invest in your service, what you should do, how to best place your development efforts such that it becomes more optimally fair enabling. I would say that is my overall answer, but I do recognize in practice there is this bit of tension that needs to be navigated. I also see, by the way, that there are a lot of questions, which is great. We're very happy with that level of engagement. I don't think we'll be able to answer all of them right here, right now. We could maybe do one or two, also looking at the time. But what I propose to do afterwards, Patricia, is that you and I go through the other questions that we were not able to tackle now and make an answer available, maybe on the website of the webinar or by some other shape or form. We'll do our best to get some responses to all of your questions afterwards. I also see a lot of people putting in their name for the workshop, so that's awesome. Thank you very much for that. We'll make sure that we reach out to you so that you receive a formal invitation. Thanks a lot. Can you maybe pick one more question, Patricia, and then I'd like to move on to the Menti?
Yeah, I don't know. There's another one on interviews, but we talked quite a lot about that. And I don't know if you want to address what we have as a definition of sustainability in terms of time. That's an interesting one.
Yeah, that is a good question. So the question is, what is the definition of sustainability? Is it 10 years? Is it 100 years? I don't think there is a hard and fast answer to that. I guess it really depends on also what the community itself view as a reasonable limit on how far ahead do you want to look. It's hard to provide guarantees for things happening 10 years from now, let alone 100 years from now. I would rephrase it. I think the onus would be, well, on us as a community of service and infrastructure providers to make sure that we take all the measures and precautions that we reasonably can do at this point in time to ensure the longevity of the data. And if that's 100 years or 10 years, that is difficult to say. Maybe even 1,000 years. All right, let's move on, because we are at 15:40. So we do want to be respectful of your time and make sure that we can close the session at or before 4 o'clock my time. We also have a couple of questions for you, because we'd also like to use this opportunity, especially since we have close to 100 participants in the audience, which is fantastic. Thank you all very much. To use that opportunity to get some feedback on what you've heard so far. And again, for now, we'll stay on the level of these overall aspects and objectives and not go into the individual recommendations, but very happy to continue that conversation as well at a later moment. So let me invite you, let me start the Menti and then invite you to join us for the Menti meter. Patricia, could you maybe put the link in the chat window as well?
Yep, ready to press, but I think you need to kick it off first. So.
Yeah, I have just done that, but bear with me because I now need to start the Menti first. Here we go. And let me then also share my screen again so people can see the questions coming in as we go. Yeah. Just to check, can people see my screen again? Patricia, can you confirm?
Yes, and the first question is an easy one to get you started.
Yeah. It is a Friday afternoon, so people might be a little bit fatigued after a long week. So we thought we would start with an easy question, but also to get a little bit of a flavor of who is in the audience and well, get to know you. So I'd invite you to go to menti.com. The code is 9294766. And tell us a bit about yourself. We have people from Canada, from Ireland, the Netherlands, the US, also people across time zones, I see. So great, thank you all. Incidentally, I was in a call yesterday with people from Australia who stayed up until 12:30 at night. Thought that was very brave. Uruguay, Estonia, Italy, Belgium, Germany. Great, very nice global representation. I'm very happy to see that. It's a bit of the, well, quite some weight on Europe, but also good representation from other geographies. We have 44 votes. Let's wait a little bit. People might still be looking for their device to log into Menti. All right, let's move on to the next question. We'd also like to know a little bit more about your roles, as that would also help us to, well, as context for the questions that we have further on. So please tell us a little bit about your professional role and the hat that you are wearing today. A lot of researchers, that's great. Very happy to see that. At the end of the day, we all do it for research and researchers. Service providers, infrastructure providers, data stewards, all well represented. One individual so far representing the funding agencies. That's also a great perspective to have in the room. Educators, also very welcome. Excellent, thank you very much. I think I'll move on. So thinking back about these different aspects that we talked about in the framework as we presented it so far, the fair enablement, quality of service, open and connected, user centricity, trustworthiness, and ethical and legal aspects. How would you rate the importance? And then importance, of course, with the ultimate view of being, of making services supporting and enabling a real fair data ecosystem and the FAIRification of data and other digital objects. I'd love to see some views on this. Seems to be fairly equal weight so far. If you have a very specific opinion about this, we'd also love to hear that. Maybe if there is a bit of time in the end, we can ask people, or feel free to leave your comment in the chat or send it to us otherwise. But if you feel strongly that one of these aspects is way more important than the others or way less important, we'd also love to hear about that. 51 people have cast their votes. By the way, I think behind the scenes, Menti is also keeping track of the distribution. We're not visualizing that right now, but that's also something that we will look at afterwards. And also see if the relative importance that is assigned by people, if that maybe varies over the different professional roles. So we have a lot of nice data analysis to look forward to, Patricia. All right, thank you very much. Are there any aspects that you feel we have missed so far? And this is an open question. No? Okay, that's clear. Still no? Governance? Yeah, thank you for that. Reliability? Pandemic, yes, we definitely missed to factor out the pandemic aspect. Business models, yeah, that's a good one. Interplay, community feedback. Related information. Thanks, all good feedback. I won't be able right here, right now to comment on each of those individually, but I definitely will use these within our task group to discuss to see if we feel we have covered some of these aspects, and if not, if we want to include that as a separate aspect, or perhaps generalize one of the existing aspects. The value to science by making data more fair, that is instrumental, of course. So if that's not sufficiently clear, we absolutely need to make that more explicit. Peanut butter, we did not think about peanut butter, I will admit. Software tools, great. This is a great remark as well. It is implicit in some of the aspects. We have also looked at FAIR for research software on a separate track within the task. There is a separate milestone report on how the FAIR principles could apply to research software as well. I don't have the link ready right here, right now, but if maybe Moran, if you're in the audience, you could put the link to that work in the chat. Trust, important aspect. Maturity models, yeah, I think we could maybe think about how to define some of our recommendations in terms of a maturity model mapping. Thank you. Vocabularies, cross-linking. Excellent, thank you. That's a lot of great feedback. We'll discuss this within the group and then see how we can use that to improve the next version. And again, if there is an aspect that you feel very strongly about, I would really, this only allows for so many texts and so much interaction. I'd really invite you to look up the report. There's a link to the to a public Google Docs version where you can leave more specific comments and suggestions as well. Thank you. Let's move on in view of the time. Are there any aspects in the framework, these 6 aspects that we presented, that you feel are overlapping too much? Have we perhaps done duplicate work there? People saying no are always the quickest to respond, because that's a very brief answer. I also see a comment, quite some overlap, but good focus points. Okay, thank you for that. Open and connected is kind of fair. Yeah, that does make sense. I agree. And I also appreciate it might be a challenging question to really have formulated your thoughts if this is the first time you have seen those aspects. But part of the webinar is also, of course, to get the thinking going. So if you have further feedback about this later on, then please do find us either through the link to the public consultation document or over email or any other way. The devil is in the details. Yes, absolutely. That is something we are very much aware about. And I also don't think we'll get all of those details sorted out, but this is really the first pass, if you like. Somebody comments that open and connected and fair enabling are somewhat similar, but could still be valuable to distinguish them. Also, these are questions that we could zoom in that workshop and see if perhaps these are aspects that should be merged or there is value in keeping them separate. Trustworthiness is rather a high-level aspect than a basic property. I would agree with that. Again, if you look at the recommendations under that objective, that tries to make it a bit more specific. But as a term, I agree with that statement. Fair enabling could be seen as an overarching term. That is true as well, in a sense. We've carved that out as a specific aspect, but in a sense, it's also the totality of what we're doing or what we believe the services should be doing. All right, thank you very much for that feedback. Let's move on. We have, I think, 1 or 2 more questions. Open question. Any other feedback on the framework so far? We accept praise, but we are specifically looking for criticism as well. That will help us to improve. So don't be shy to formulate your candid feedback. Very high level so far. Yeah, I understand that point. I would invite you to take a look at the report and see if the recommendations make it a little less high level detail. I understand, in particular for this presentation, I very much appreciate that comment. The need to engage with the domain data clusters. Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you. And this is definitely what we will be pursuing over the next couple of months, but good to hear that reaffirmed. So the comment on what does it mean to apply FAIR to a service? Does it mean the service itself is more findable? To some extent, but the primary point is that it's about FAIR enablement, how the service can help data and other digital objects become more fair. That is really the starting point for at least our investigation and how we've tried to formulate that framework. A checklist or more measurable aspects, yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you for that. If our finances stop, are there many parties that will carry it on? That is always a challenging question, of course. Our work so far is project-based. But one of the reasons why we're also so keen to engage with the community going forward is not only to improve it so far, but also have a broader embedding and hopefully see further adoption and perhaps other groups of people who can carry it forward. Thank you very much for that feedback. And again, we'll really take that to heart and discuss it with the group. After this is completed, how would you want to benefit, or how would you see benefiting from an assessment framework? So when this work is done, we have made available, say, the perfect assessment framework, if we manage to do that, thinking in that hypothetical scenario, what would be the value for it? How would you see yourself benefiting from it? If you do not see yourself benefiting from it, that is also a response we'd like to know. Certification, validation, yeah, thank you. Benchmarking, yeah, very good. A fair trust seal, I like that. Training, yeah. Improvement of the service. Easier to implement things. Thank you very much. Good. Advertisements. Identify own gaps. I really like that one. That's at least one of the things that we would like it to support. I'll leave it open for half a minute or so if people have additional thoughts that they would like to share. Building trust, good one. Tools, planning. Quality assurance, also a very good point. Collaboration, yeah, thanks for that. All right, thank you all for that feedback. I think I cheated a little bit earlier when I said we had one or two more questions. I think we have two more, but maybe in view of the time, I'll just do one, which is around the workshop. So we're tentatively aiming for 19 February. Announcement will follow shortly. We are interested if you would like to join, if of course calendar calendar permitting. And if you do, some of you have already put their email addresses in the chat. If you haven't done that yet and you would like to, please do, or just send us an email. Then we'll make sure that you get a proper invitation. And since so many are interested, I am still going to ask the last question. Could you tell us a little bit about what you would like to get out of that workshop? If you're planning to attend, what do you hope to get out of the workshop? And that will help us to choose the right format and the right scoping. Examples, okay? Pragmatic approach, find out more. Best practices, do's and don'ts. So I think there's a lot around knowledge sharing, learning from each other. Impact, proof of concept, do's and don'ts. Yeah. Last option to tell us a little bit more about how the workshop would be of value to you to help us move this in the right direction. All right, I'm going to close the Menti because we are coming close to the hour. I think you should still be able to see my screen if I do this, just to check.
You're back on the slides.
Yeah, wonderful. So thanks a lot for that feedback. That is really super valuable, and we'll take it on board and we'll take it to heart. So just to reiterate, there's a sequence of things we want to do to get feedback, like you just gave us, but to also do that in other settings through workshops and active community consultation. So I just wanted to finish with one slide. Thanks a lot to Team Task 2.4. The names are listed here. I won't go through the whole list, but the names are visible here. Really a team effort. I think we're doing this together in a very nice way. I find it very constructive, very enjoyable, and a lot of people who contributed at earlier stages as well that I wanted to thank. So with that, and again, also wanting to be respectful of your time, and we all have a lot of online meetings. So thank you all very much for participating. We very much appreciate your interest and your feedback. And we leave it at that for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.